Okay, hello everybody. Welcome back. I know this is a very health conscious crowd because when I tried to put skim milk in my coffee, the container was empty, but the cream, the half and half, was full. So welcome back to the panel. The theme of this next panel is women's leadership, how far we've come in the 20 years since the Beijing conference and the founding of the Women's Foreign Policy Group. I'm Eleanor Clift. I was with Newsweek for decades. I now write for the Daily Beast, and I'm also a panelist on the McLaughlin Group. The panel will not be like the McLaughlin Group, but it will be a conversation among friends. I want to ask Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues, Catherine Russell, Kathy, to kick off the panel.
Goodness, sorry about that. It's nice to see you all. Eleanor, thank you so much for that introduction. I appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here to celebrate 20 years of the Women's Foreign Policy Group, which is amazing to me, actually, that it's happened so quickly. Looking around here at the Ritz-Carlton, it's clear that we've come a very long way from Pat Ellis's kitchen table, which is the humble birthplace of a very vital and vigorous organization. For 20 years, the Women's Foreign Policy Group has served women at all stages and phases of their careers, from the women posted as their country's first ambassadors to the United States, to the college graduates looking to get their foot in the door with an internship or a mentor. For several generations of women, this organization has been a helpline, a source of tremendous information, and a real support group. Its mere existence is testament to the dedication of women like Pat and Julia Block, but also to the state of gender equality right here in Washington. In my travels, I often meet people who think the United States has it all figured out when it comes to gender equality. But if you look at the issues facing women here, the issues that my fellow panelists will talk about, it's clear that our priorities to advance women around the world are also priorities for women here at home. Kathleen Matthews is a perfect example of what women have to offer the business world, even if, as was Kathleen's case, before she joined Marriott, they aren't 100% certain that the business world is right for them. And honestly, who can blame them? In every country around the globe, there are stereotypes and cultural attitudes that send a message to women and girls about their proper roles. And those attitudes are often ingrained in laws and practices that make it harder for a woman to start her own business, make a fair wage, simply because of her gender. But what we see over and over again is that these barriers don't hold back only women. They hold back entire communities and economies as well. Experts have said that if women's labor force participation rose to comparable male levels, GDP would rise too, by 5 percentage points in the United States, by 9 in Japan, and by 34 in Egypt. So we have to ask the question, can we afford not to invest in women's economic participation? Pushing for more women in the workforce is just part of the solution. Pushing for women's political participation is really equally important. We need more women in politics, more women like Representative Debbie Dingell, my friend who I'm so delighted to see here this morning and who I'm really delighted to see in Congress, who understand the challenges facing women and can get these issues on the table. The last time I traveled to Japan, I met the mayor of Yokohama, who was the first woman to hold her job. And as mayor, she's made it a priority to increase access to childcare so moms could get back to work. In a remarkably short period of time, she reduced the waiting list for daycare from several thousand families to 0, which is truly astounding. Her leadership did more than address concerns for women. It also addressed an issue that was holding back the local workforce, the local economy, and indeed the entire economy of this country of Japan. That's what happens when a country's politicians represent not just some, but all of its citizens. I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 points with my final co-panelist, Jamira, whose story is also truly incredible, and you'll hear more about that in a minute. When she was a teenager, Jamira's brother was tragically shot and killed. And since that moment, 10 years ago, Jamira has been a dedicated advocate for young people and for gun violence prevention. We'll hear more about her work, but to me, she illustrates both the power of young people, particularly young women, and the absolute necessity of civil society. If you spend any time with children, you know that to underestimate young people is to do so at your own risk. They are full of potential and ideas, but it's up to us to give them opportunities, to make sure they have the education and the support to pursue their dreams and raise their voices. I'm a firm believer that the United States government can be one of the most powerful forces for good in the world, and we're dedicated to supporting young women and girls like Jamira around the globe. Many of you, I'm sure, saw that the President and the First Lady launched an initiative earlier this year called Let Girls Learn. It's focused on helping adolescent girls attend and complete secondary school, diploma in hand, ready to contribute to their economies. But governments really cannot do this work alone. When you look at the challenges of the 21st century, from climate change to violent extremism, these issues demand solutions that will require all of us to pitch in. At its best, civil society prods us to do better. I probably shouldn't say this in front of the press, but I sometimes liken meetings with civil society to having your teeth cleaned, right? It's not always the most pleasant, but it really is critically important. They support us, they challenge us, and they are a crucial partner in the work to advance women and girls. And in that process, we foster peace and prosperity for all. In the face of global challenges and a changing world, all of us have to act together to achieve progress. That means we need everyone, not just women, but also men sitting around kitchen tables, thinking up big ideas to empower women and girls, and driving those ideas to fruition. So if we take just one lesson from the Women's Foreign Policy Group, it is the incredible power of big thinking coupled with commitment and perseverance. Thank you all for the work you've done over the last 2 decades to support women here in Washington and around the world. You've changed not only the conversation, you have truly changed women's lives. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Ambassador Russell. I want to briefly introduce the members of the panel. You have fuller bios in your program, but to Kathy's right is Debbie, otherwise known as Congresswoman Debbie Dingell. She represents Michigan's 12th district, and before that she was president of General Motors Foundation and senior public affairs executive for 30 years. On her right, in orange, is Kathleen Matthews, who recently stepped down as Chief Global Communications and Public Affairs Officer at Marriott, and she's now running for Congress in Maryland. And I have to say, I bumped into her husband, Chris Matthews, at the Starbucks the other day, and he told me that he couldn't have been more surprised when she told him she wanted to run for Congress than if she told him she was joining the Marines. So I'm sure she's heard that at home. And then on the far end of the panel is Jamira Burley. She is with Amnesty International, and she advocates against gun violence and for criminal justice. And she is the U.S. representative to the United Nations Global Education First Initiative, and brings a welcome and different perspective to the panel of otherwise what I would call veterans. I want to start with Debbie, who has to leave early because of her obligations on Capitol Hill. And I forewarned all the panelists that I wanted to ask them where they were 20 years ago, the time of the Beijing conference and the founding of this foreign policy group, you know, what their aspirations were at the time and whether they imagined they'd be where they are today, and then to project forward, maybe not 20 years for themselves, but 20 years for women like themselves. Debbie, do you want to start?
First of all, thank you, Eleanor. And I call us seasoned, not veterans. And it's great to see so many women out here and to see women that I've worked with on many of the issues 20 years ago and to see the young women here today. So it's great. 20 years ago, I was at General Motors and totally convinced that I would finish my career there as a very senior executive. I remember what was going on in Beijing so clearly. I think that many of the women in this room have really experienced the world as it's been changing. When I interviewed for my job at General Motors, I was asked, why would a woman want to work at General Motors? So that's how, and I'm not that old. You know, we're talking about Title IX, and I said to some group the other day, you know, when I was in school, Title IX wasn't there. And their eyes get like this. Well, we've been a group of people in transition as we have seen the world change. I didn't imagine that I would be in the United States Congress right now, but I do believe that women bring a different perspective. Women have the ability to make a difference. Pat Ellis has done such a fabulous job leading this group, helping to ensure that women come into the public policy arena, the foreign policy arena, and bring that different perspective. I missed the first panel, but I heard it was fabulous. And I think we have a different voice, and we speak in a different voice. I'm wearing red today. Women on the Hill wear red on Wednesdays, Republican and Democrats, to bring attention to Boko Haram until those women are released. Wow. And it's not a partisan, we're gonna bring women's voices together and remind people. So I think I'm excited that Kathleen's running, but I think we need women in both parties, and that we do bring a different voice when we're talking about these issues that are very, very important.
And then to follow up, I overheard you whispering to Kathy that you had just come from the Democratic caucus this morning and that it was so emotional over trade. So give us some sense of what it's like on the inside, and you know, just as a new member of Congress, not necessarily from the women's perspective. I'm not sure the women's perspective is any different on this one.
It's not, though. I have a friend that's a woman that it came out over the weekend, and she's understanding what happens when labor decides that you're their number one target. It's not easy. But I'm obviously inside the caucus. I think this trade vote is one of the most difficult votes that I have seen in my lifetime. And obviously, I come from Detroit. I come from a manufacturing state where we're trading in a global marketplace, and we need to be trading in that global marketplace, but we need to be doing it on a level playing field. My husband and I weren't on the same page on NAFTA. He opposed NAFTA, I supported NAFTA. We weren't on the same page on the Korea Free Trade Agreement. He opposed it, I supported it. But I have to cast a vote this time, and most of the Democratic caucus is not supporting the president. Our leader, Pelosi, has been trying to find a path forward. I think everybody wants to support the president. We all know that we have to compete in a global marketplace, but we've got to compete on a level playing field. I'll be quick, but you know, I come from Michigan. Right now the yen's at one of the highest in 15, 20 years, and I didn't look at it yesterday, but it's approximately 124 to $1. At that rate, there's an $8,000 to $10,000 cost differential per vehicle. That's then sold in this country that is either being used to reduce the cost of parts, advertise it, or reduce the overall cost of a vehicle. We can compete with, Toyota made more money on currency manipulation than Ford Motor Company did in worldwide productions last year. We can compete with anybody, but we can't compete with the Bank of Japan or the Japanese government. And this is the very first time that the auto companies and the unions are aligned, concerned over currency manipulation. And there's a vote, I think this is all public now, so I pray to God I'm not giving anything away, that it's going to rules today. It appears that there will be 2 votes, that the bill will be divided, that came from the Senate, and people are being asked to vote on a trade adjustment assistance provision that would cut Medicare. And the leader has been working with Speaker Boehner trying to find another pay for, but as long as that comes to the floor where Democrats are being asked to trade off Medicare to hurt seniors for trade adjustment assistance, which by the way is equally important. We need to help our workers. But it was made very clear by the leader and quite frankly by Jim Clyburn, that this had become a catch-22 situation, and we had had bumps in the road, we had had potholes, and we may have found a sinkhole. So hopefully I'm not giving something away. But people feel emotional. I mean, this is a very emotional, difficult situation. I know where I am. I got sent to protect the American worker.
Right. So is that a yes vote from you? Or
No.
Right, you would be on the White House gettable, but not,
I don't think the White House has had me ungettable since before I got sworn in.
Okay, okay, all right. All right, Kathleen, why don't we start out with the same question with you. 20 years ago, what you were doing and whether you imagined this future for yourself, and what...
Short answer is no. And again, it's also great, like Kathy and Debbie have said, to be in a room full of other great women, but also so many great friends. So wonderful to look out at all of you. And Debbie said such an important thing, because what she identified was her core and her purpose. She was sent to Congress to protect the American worker, and I think that that's what all of us try to tap into in our lives. So for me, really, I think my core, if I look at sort of my first and second career and looking at my third, is really being an advocate for women. And I didn't come to that deliberately. It found me, I think. So 20 years ago, I was a local news reporter and anchor at ABC7 WJLA TV, and I had been given the opportunity to host a TV show called Working Woman. So when Hillary Clinton was there in Beijing talking about human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights, I put that on my Working Woman show as the headline news. I mean, it was sort of such a seminal moment, I think, for us, a chilling moment. To see her in a place that most of us had never visited, talking to an audience of international women, and to stand there as the First Lady of this country and be an advocate for all of us, but also women who are not nearly as lucky as all of us. And so I really thought I would end my career as a journalist. I thought maybe I'd go from local television, having that syndicated show, Working Woman, that first was local, then it became national, and then we were lucky it went into international syndication, because women all over the world were looking for inspiration. They were looking for, who are the role models? And then how do I get to be like them? But they were also looking for, I think, validation of the struggles they faced. And so it was a TV show that focused on sort of the role models, but also the impediments to getting ahead for women all over the world. It was that theme, I think, of Working Women that kind of gave me an identity and a brand that really was very helpful for my career, in fact. And it was that purpose, I think, that made moving into business really appealing to me. When Marriott International, which is a local Fortune 200 company based in Bethesda, came to me and tried to recruit me to head up their global communications. And I went into that job again with that sense of purpose. So, okay, if I come here and I'm promoting the company in beautiful hotels like this Ritz, which is one of my favorite hotels, love coming down here, what is the purpose that will give meaning to my job every day? And for me, it was advocating for women. When I came to the company, we had 2 women on our corporate board. Now we have 4. So we are well ahead of the Fortune 200 in terms of number of women on corporate boards. And that's
out of
critical.
how many?
And that's out of 11.
Okay.
So that is, when you have 1 woman on a corporate board, she basically doesn't say anything because she doesn't want to rock the boat. When you have 2, they're each waiting for the other. It's a standoff. Who's gonna be the person speaking out? When you've got 3, you suddenly have a critical mass. When you have 4, it doesn't make any difference. They're there not only as women, but sort of as advocates for their point of view. And it's a critical tipping point that's been identified in research. When I came to the Marriott, I was the only woman reporting to the CEO. Now there are 3 of us. One heads up continental Europe, one has our biggest corporate division heading up brands, marketing, and sales. And then my role, which was global communications and public affairs, which included our government affairs. And I'm sending lots of women's resumes to my CEO now, trying to make sure that he keeps those 3 women as his direct reports in finding the best woman and the best person to replace me. Mm-hmm. And I think it was really when I made a decision about a month ago to run for Congress when Chris Van Hollen, our local congressman in Montgomery County, decided he would run for Barbara Mikulski's seat. So, I just thought, well, Barbara Mikulski's leaving. bring another woman in there, right, to represent the Maryland people, and to join people like Debbie Dingell in Congress. But it was also that belief and that exposure I had working for a global company, knowing that there are women like me who work for Marriott, and there are housekeepers all over the world working for Marriott, who are coming into jobs sometimes for the first time, having a job, and they're supporting their families. They're trying to get their kids to school, whether they live in South Africa or Myanmar or Washington, D.C. And to be an advocate sort of for that opportunity agenda, for me, was the purpose that kind of drove me. And I think it started 20 years ago with Hillary Clinton in Beijing that helped sort of coalesce that sense of being a woman who can advocate for women, but also, interestingly, in advocating for women.
Right.
Am I on? Yeah. In advocating for women, it also was my own personal pathway in my career. So it was the win-win for me in many ways. Something that gave me purpose, but also gave me opportunity myself.
I don't know whether you logged how many miles you traveled by air, whether you're up there with Hillary Clinton, but you traveled a lot around the world, and read one report that in India, Marriott has 16 hotels, and they're trying to bring people in at the very basic level, the housekeepers, and have a training program. Is this all part of a new awareness in corporate America? And how big a battle has this been to get corporations to think along these lines?
I sort of took for granted that you would have a good representation of women at all levels in business. Because coming from journalism, I think really the movement to put women out front as the co-anchor on the evening news or, as a correspondent really started for us with people like Eleanor Cliff in the 60s and 70s. So Eleanor was a
70s, not 60s.
Okay. but in the 60s, you were sowing the seeds.
The 70s was basically there were lawsuits.
Right.
Newsweek had the first class action lawsuit to break the gender barrier, and that was followed by the New York Times. Judy Woodruff, who moderated the panel before me, also was part of that.
Right, and there's a great book by
crowd.
Povich talking about that lawsuit.
Yeah.
So I, when I came into my TV career, I kind of took for granted because there were women who were reporters, and you were just starting to put a woman co-anchor on the set in local news. You didn't have them at the network, but we all assumed that would happen eventually. But you didn't have women having children, so there were still, I was the first woman in my newsroom who was on the air to get pregnant and have kids, and that was sort of the beginning of sort of that role modeling that you could do all of this and keep your job. But when I went to business, I assumed it would be the same, that we'd see a fair representation. And I remember some of my first meetings, and our company is known for its diversity and its inclusion, but I would go to award ceremonies in a room like this, and there wouldn't be a single woman getting an award on stage because they just had not filtered up in the ranks of owning hotels or managing hotels. And I actually, in the nearly 10 years that I've been with Marriott, have seen tremendous improvement in all of that. But you also, and I think that, you see an opportunity agenda. It's a matter of business understanding. Number one, it's not just a good thing to do. It's not just a diverse and inclusive thing to do, but it's a smart business decision. And I think that's what we've seen in our company, that essentially bringing women in who are going to be incredibly loyal because you've given them a job, they can support their families, they're going to work hard, and you give them the training, and they rise so quickly. And so, in places like Rwanda, where we're opening up a hotel, and I've got to start saying we because I left Marriott last week, but we identified that we needed and wanted women to be able to staff that hotel, and we found a partnership with a group called the Aquila Institute that was training women in different kinds of careers, including hospitality. We didn't have a hotel open yet, so we formed a partnership where we brought them to Dubai, which has some of the top hospitality standards in the world, and we have 40 women who are working, earning salaries, and moving up in their roles so that when that hotel opens in Rwanda, because they all want to go back to Rwanda, they will be managers, they will be supervisors, they will have moved up every part of the company. Similarly, we've done this in India, where we've actually gone recruiting in places where you have rural families, you have sort of caste systems, what we used to call the untouchables, but it's a lower caste system, and finding young women and convincing their parents to let us have them come and work on our hotels, which has all sorts of cultural issues, but then bringing those women through something called the Mahindra Foundation, a partnership with a big Indian philanthropy, and they are now staffing all of our hotels and rising up in the ranks as they then can send money home to their families, but also become self-sufficient in supporting their family. Those are some of the most rewarding, and seeing those success stories is just phenomenal all over the world.
Thank you. Jamira, reading your life history is truly inspirational. First in your family to graduate high school and college. You grew up in a rough neighborhood in Philadelphia. The odds were against you. You succeeded. Tell us, what was it that kept you going and gave you the means and the incentive to basically do what a lot of people that you grew up with were unable to do?
So first of all, I'm very happy that you didn't ask where I was 20 years ago. Because I was coloring, yeah. But ironically enough, 20 years ago was probably the first time I became very aware of the social and economic standards in my community and how it was impacting people, particularly young people. When I was 6 years old, my two eldest brothers were convicted of murder. And I remember being in the courtroom, not being old enough or tall enough for my feet to touch the floor, but being in that room just made me realize that my issues, the issues that were impacting my community, was so much larger than me. And growing up in Philadelphia, I mean, I grew up in some of the best and worst neighborhoods that Philadelphia has to offer, with some of the most amazing people and some of the most interesting people. But I grew up in a family with I had 10 older brothers. So yes, I know all about men. So I grew up with 10 older brothers, and for me, growing up with them, I was extremely sheltered as a child. Even having watched both of my brothers be incarcerated, and also seeing both of my parents get incarcerated, I was extremely sheltered. And in 2005, I think for me was kind of the aha moment. It was the year that my 20-year-old brother, Andre, was shot and killed in Philadelphia. And at 15 years old, I was stunned, but also I was inspired by my principal and my teachers to either continue to be a victim or get up and do something about it. And so for me, that was the opportunity to realize that, one, not only as a young person I could do something, but also as a person who was directly impacted by the issue could do something. And so I became engaged in training young people how to be peer mediators, how to be how to perform conflict resolution in classrooms. And through the course of that, we decreased violence at Overbrook High School by nearly 30% over the course of 6 months. And that kind of escalated my engagement into gun violence and violence prevention. And now, if I was to think back 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I would have never thought that my work would have exceeded outside my zip code, let alone outside my city. I've traveled to more than 15 different countries. I've met with young people all over the world. And one thing that is extremely, I think, dire is the fact that when we talk about this pipeline or creating spaces for women in spaces and places that were never meant for us, it's really about education. How do we provide young people, particularly girls, not just here in America, but around the world, with opportunities to really be the breadwinner, to be able to adequately provide and engage in society, and that's through providing them comprehensive education. And so being a part of the UN Youth Advocacy Group, I think, allows me to use my experience that I've gained on the local level to really help to inform change that needs to happen on the global level, particularly around providing young women opportunities for education.
You know, there's an ongoing debate in this country about the role of government and whether government is, the government's role is working in terms of alleviating the ills of poverty, or whether government is doing entirely the wrong things. If you could talk about perhaps some of the specific programs or initiatives that helped you. I think you've been quoted saying the number one reason people don't finish college is because they can't afford it.
Yeah. That's very true. I mean, but I would also say I graduated high school. I not only became the first of 16 children to graduate high school, but I graduated at the top of my class in a family where education wasn't a priority. And it wasn't a priority not because people didn't think that education was important, but when you think about all the other adversities that people in communities that I come from have, to them, education is not the number one issue. They're steadily trying to think about how do you provide for your family, how do you keep the lights on? And when that comes into play, education sometimes falls to the wayside. But for me, it was through the course of having women who looked like me, come from neighborhoods like me, who were in positions of power, provide me guidance, but also help me and assist me in applying to college, applying to scholarships. I think we take for granted that young people don't apply for scholarships and for jobs because they're lazy. Maybe the case is that they just don't know how. And so it's providing not a hand up, but really a handout. I mean, not providing a handout, but a hand up. And really creating opportunities and opening doors for people who may never have had those opportunities. But I would also say one of the biggest, I think, things that I learned is that I never, even now at 26, I don't know what I want to be in 20 years. But what I do and what I did always know is that I never wanted to live paycheck to paycheck. I never wanted to be homeless. I never wanted to depend on anyone else. But more importantly, I always wanted to contribute to my community. And I found places and opportunities that allowed me to not only get an education, but also give back to the communities I came from, but also communities that I'm not from, but that had young people who are impacted by the same issues I were.
A lot of this, go ahead.
On the education point, it's so interesting. I was reading that if you are middle to upper middle class, you are, by age 24, 80% likely to have a college degree. And that's up since 1970 from 60%. So we went from 60 to 80% by age 24 having the college diploma. The diploma is really critical, not just going to college, but having the diploma. If you are poor in America, you are 8%, not 80, but 8% likely to have your diploma by age 24, and that's gone up from 6%. So it's a tenfold difference. And I think if you look back on women and many of our mothers, that was the differential for women in opportunity, was getting to go to college and getting that college degree. And you had so many men of that generation that fought in World War II in this country that had the GI Bill and got that college degree, and that was the middle class creation in America. And women lagged, but as women, as we advanced, more and more women were getting that degree. Now it's not so much a gender difference as it is an economic difference. Mm-hmm. And that really, I think, is the core of income inequality in America. Right. And if you look overseas in a lot of emerging markets, you still have the situation that we had where it's a gender difference. It's economic, but it's also a gender difference because they have not yet caught up with us in terms of the gender opportunity.
Right. A lot of what Jamira has accomplished comes from within her, but if you're a policymaker, you want to say, okay, what were the specific lifelines? Are there people, a school counselor perhaps?
Yes.
Well,
I mean, in Philadelphia, so prior to joining Amnesty, I was the executive director of the City of Philadelphia's Commission on Youth. And the year before I left, at a time where we had a $400 million deficit in our public education, we had a $400 million prison that was being built. So when you think about creating opportunities for young people and creating pipelines, we have to ask where are the dollars being sent and where do our priorities lie? So if we say education is a priority, that's not true if the money doesn't reflect it. And we can't say that making sure our streets are safe is true if the money and the opportunities don't reflect it. Or we can't say providing people jobs and opportunities is true if those jobs and opportunities aren't there for them to apply or they're not employable. So I think we have to have a serious conversation on where do our priorities lie and whether or not those priorities fit on our bottom line, and making sure that we have the adequate resources to provide everyone, gender included, but also social economic opportunities across the border.
Okay. Kathy, getting back to you, I should ask you the 20 years ago question as well.
20 years ago. 20 years ago, I was an Associate Deputy Attorney General at the Justice Department, so I was a fairly young lawyer back then.
Under Janet Reno?
Yes.
Right, okay.
Yes, and I had come there from Capitol Hill, where I was a staff director of the Senate Judiciary Committee, working for then Senator Biden. obviously now the Vice President, and he had done some work on the Violence Against Women Act. He authored it and got it passed on the crime bill in 1994. So that was my first sort of work on issues related to women. That wasn't my field, it wasn't the way I had sort of thought about my career. And so I came into this world of women really focused on the violence question, and I, through a whole series of events, ended up working more on the international side, and again, focused on women and sort of the inordinate amount of violence that women all over the world face. And I'm sure people here have seen the numbers of 1 in 3 women in the world faces some sort of violence in her life. And so that really motivated me, and I did some more work on Capitol Hill on that issue. But as I got more into this field, I realized that while women are clearly victims in way too many parts of the world, they also have tremendous capacity to make contributions to their societies if they are economically empowered, if they're politically empowered. And that's really how we approach the work that I do now in my office, which is to try to look at women and their experience in a really comprehensive way, and to try to make sure that they have protection, certainly from violence, but also that they have education, that they have economic opportunities. And I think I've now come to see that women, while the women as victims is certainly part of the narrative, you can't deny that, but women as what we like to call agents of change is also critically important. And more countries see that, and I think that's why President Obama, Secretary Kerry, Secretary Clinton talk about women's empowerment as a strategic priority for the United States, because we know that if you empower women, if they can participate fully, it'll make certainly them and their families better off, but also their communities and their countries, and make them more stable.
Yeah, obviously we have a lot of challenges in this country, but when you travel around the world, sometimes you come away thinking how fortunate we are. And I see that you recently traveled to Baghdad and to, was it Amman, and talked to women who were survivors of ISIS, who had struggled to get away from ISIS. If you can talk about that, and their, resettling seems a big challenge.
Well, it's interesting. I think the international community is very focused on trying to deal with this issue of violence that women suffer in conflict, frequently sexual violence, but not always. The interesting thing about ISIL, and it's similar to, I think Kathleen mentioned Nigeria and Boko Haram, is that we're now looking at non-state actors, essentially, who are doing these horrific things against women, to women, and we're trying to grapple with how best to deal with that. I mean, these are forces and people who aren't really too worried about going to, the Geneva and being brought up on criminal charges, or, really facing, excuse me, any consequences for what they're doing. So we're really struggling with how to deal with that. Pardon me. The women in Iraq, thank you. The women in Iraq and really in that region, and again, we see this in many places, they're targeted specifically because forces understand how undermining it is to communities to have women treated the way they're treating some of these women. What we've seen in Iraq and Syria is these women, Yazidi women, largely but not entirely, are being abducted. They are being sold repeatedly to fighters for ISIL, and then they are coming back, if they're lucky, hopefully, to communities where very traditional norms and understandings of women and the notions of their virtue, and how that has probably been challenged in these circumstances. And so the whole society is struggling with how to deal with that. We're trying to support the government of Iraq to deal with these issues more aggressively. Obviously, they're in the middle of a conflict, and that always makes it much more challenging for everybody who's trying to address the problems. But what we know is if we don't figure out a way to deal with these challenges, if we can't help these women hopefully get freed and then re-emerge into their societies in a constructive way, that the long-term consequences of that are just horrific for their societies. So I think all of us are working hard to try to figure out how to do that better.
Yeah, I read recently that there is a debate going on about whether international funds can be used to fund abortions for women who have been impregnated by ISIS fighters. Is that I mean, I'm not sure the State Department gets involved in that, but
Well, you had Ann Richard here. She actually, that's her bailiwick at the State Department. Ann Richard,
oh,
who was
oh,
before me.
who
That's
was
in the
here
Office
earlier.
of Population. But you know, look, U.S. federal law is we abide by the strictures saying that we can't use any U.S. funds for abortion services. There are certainly others who are out there doing things like that. I think really, from my perspective, it just points out the challenges that these women are facing. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I had one woman talk to me about how on their birth certificate, some of these children who are born of women who have been impregnated by some of these terrorists, they're putting on their birth certificates the name of the mother, and then in the indication for father it says terrorist. And you think, you know, what are the prospects for these children growing up? And I think there are so many difficulties, and even putting aside this conflict, many of these societies have sort of existing challenges for women, where they are, you know, I was struck by what Jamira was saying about education. From our perspective, getting girls educated, you know, I always say if I had to do one thing, that is the single most important thing, I think, to do, because it does open up the world for them. But in so many places, and this is why the president is asked us to do some more work on this, girls don't even get to secondary education. And, you know, they're sent either to the market to work, into the fields to work, they're working at home, taking care of children. In too many cases, they're married off young and having children themselves, and obviously the consequences of that are horrific. So I take your point that, you know, we have a lot of work to do in this country, but there are places in the world where just, you know, being a girl it's just hard to see how they move forward, and we're really committed to trying to make life better for these girls, because I think when I hear Jamira talk to me, these young girls are just endless sources of strength and potential, and when I see that, all those opportunities for them truncated, it is truly heartbreaking, and I think we all have to do better by them.
I want to just give a shout out to this administration, because I think, you know, they have done such a good job, I think, of integrating this conversation about women in sort of our foreign policy. I had a chance to go with Ambassador Russell to Bali for the Asia-Pacific economic conversation that was going on, to make sure that the women's agenda was going to be filtered through those economic talks. You know, the office of, or the initiatives on women here domestically that this administration has done, and it really started with Secretary Clinton creating the role of the ambassador for women's initiatives at the State Department. That is Kathy's job with Milan Vivir initially, and then Kathy, but also just to constantly put that conversation. What about the women? You know, it's kind of Abigail Adams' clarion call to us. What about the women in every conversation that goes on?
There's a question here that flows immediately from what you're saying, and that is, how can we empower women without disempowering men, particularly in Muslim countries?
Look, men and boys have to be part of this conversation, and I don't see it, I don't believe it is a zero-sum game. I believe that if you empower women, it'll make these communities and societies stronger, and that is to the advantage of everyone in the community. That's why it's a strategic priority for the United States. I think that we too often talk to ourselves, and we all know the problems. We have a pretty good idea of what we're trying to do to address the problems. But if we don't include everyone in the society in the discussion, I think we're really limiting our ability to be successful. And so I meet with men. We have programming that looks at boys. And I think, you know, I always make this point that I have 2 children. I have a daughter and a son. And I know, and it's anecdotal, but, you know, they don't come out with gender norms, right? Those are learned behaviors, and we need to get in early and try to make sure that they understand that everyone should have equal opportunities. And, you know, certainly some societies are more challenging than others, but I have met, you know, I'll just give you an example. Malala Yousafzai's dad is the person he talks about. The second he knew he was having a daughter, he was thrilled and he was committed to getting her educated. And I think male champions like that are absolutely a critical part of our efforts.
And can I, just to add on to that, there's an advocate here in the U.S. who talks about rape a lot, and one of the things she said is that we have to teach boys not to rape. And it's this conversation that, again, it's learned behavior that we as a society have thrown onto both men and girls. And also one of the things that I think is really important is that when you liberate any specific group or subgroup, true liberation has to liberate that entire community. So we're not just talking about improving outcomes for girls, but how do you improve and build a better family, communities, and countries? And that's through the collaboration of both male and female in the household.
I'm struck by, you said you had 10 older brothers.
I'm struck by it too.
2 of them were murdered and others perhaps were incarcerated.
Mm-hmm.
What would have saved them, do you think? I mean, so you're advocating
mm-hmm.
for women's issues, but you're advocating much more broadly.
Yeah. I think when you think about the responsibilities we place on young people to become adults, to be men at very young ages, or for instance, my father wasn't in the household, and so I remember at very early ages when my mom used to be like, "You're the man of the house," and I think that's really wrong to put that pressure on a child, and it forces them into being too older. It forces them to be adults too early in their age. And for my brothers, it was trying to do the responsibility of being a student as well as try to provide for the family, which I think is the wrong thing to do. And when you think about how could my brothers have not went down that pathway, a lot of the things that they got involved in was through the pipeline, the school to prison pipeline. Is disciplinary zero tolerance policies in schools that filter students into this pipeline where they're more likely, if you're black, to be incarcerated, if Hispanic, more likely to be deported if you don't have your proper paperwork or you're not seen as a US citizen. And so I think it's really creating systems that allows for young people to be young people, and we're not criminalizing everything that they do, and therefore punishing them for the most smallest infraction. One of my mentors always say that we are all better than the worst, we're all much better than the worst thing we've ever committed. And so if we judge young people on one single thing that they've done as a child for the rest of their lives, it puts them in a box where they're never able to really succeed.
That's beautifully said. Kathleen, here's a hint of the kind of questions you will get on the campaign trail.
She got it.
Will Marriott pay all of its employees a living wage, both in the Washington and international areas? Please state the average salary for a female Marriott employee in the U.S.
So I, on the campaign trail, have obviously got to look back at my Marriott experience and everything that I learned and take away from that, but I also have to distance myself as a candidate from Marriott. So I'm no longer a Marriott spokesperson as of last Tuesday. That said, there's a really robust argument going on in this country about raising the federal minimum wage. I personally feel that it's long overdue. We last raised the minimum wage in 2007, and we've got some catching up to do. I know our company in managed hotels like this pays well above the minimum wage, and in fact pays an entry-level person in the sort of salary range that we're talking about in these new minimum wage increases. And there are a lot of states and local jurisdictions that have already moved to the $15 an hour. Maryland is moving in that direction, DC's moving in that direction, Seattle, Los Angeles. So you're seeing, in the absence of federal legislation, local jurisdictions doing that. That said, you also have to recognize that earning and living in a place like Washington, D.C. has a different cost of living than if you're in a suburb of Des Moines, Iowa. And so for business, there's got to be a good conversation about what business can actually handle vis-a-vis, the earnings that it needs to continue to employ people. So I think that's where the conversation has to happen. Mm-hmm. And so perhaps the federal is not the right approach. I believe the federal should set the base, and then that conversation should happen at the local level. So I was very proud to work for a company that I believe did have an opportunity agenda, has paid very fair wages, and most of those wages and those hourly jobs are women's wages, because you're talking about, in a hotel like this, housekeepers, but you're also talking about bellmen who tend to be men. And what's amazing to me is to see how many people have been in those jobs for 20, 30 years and put their kids through college on those jobs because of the opportunity and the reinvestment and the training and the way that they were able to move up within the company through the training that the company provides.
Okay, this is for Ambassador Russell. Is the strategic imperative of supporting and highlighting women as change agents genuinely shared by elites and the most educated classes in the more stable Middle Eastern countries? What kind of a reception do you get?
You know, it's interesting. And I think this is due largely to work of people like all of you in this room. At this point, when we have conversations about the importance of women participating, you rarely get people who push back on that. They understand the argument, and the data, I mean, everybody in this world, in our world, talks constantly about we need more data. And that's absolutely true. We need more data. But we do have data to support the proposition that countries will do better, particularly on the economic side, if women are participating. You see it now. Kathleen mentioned the board question. You see data to support that if there are more than 3 women on a board, or 3 or more women, the boards will be generally sort of better achieving, and the companies will do better. And so around the world, and really most places, people get that argument. They want their countries to succeed. They look at a country like Japan. I mentioned the mayor of Yokohama. Japan, Prime Minister Abe has been very aggressive talking about how in Japan where 67 to 70% of women who have their first child drop out of the workforce. Japan is now in a situation where their workforce is aging. They don't really have much of an immigrant population to pick up the slack. So their labor force is constricting, and what they need is to get women to come back into the labor force. And of course the women look at it and are like, yeah, I don't think so. I mean, there's very little childcare. Right. They don't come in an opportunity where they're really feeling like they can contribute at a high level in these companies. And so we point to these situations, and I think most leaders understand. Once in a while, they may not agree with it, but I think they mostly get it. And I think we try to make the argument this is in their self-interest. We're not asking them to do something nice. We're asking them to do something that will help their country. Actually doing it is very difficult in many, many places. As I said, people think the United States has it all figured out. There is no country in the world where women have full equality. That is the reality of the situation. Not a single country. Every country has gender-based violence. So we can't say, hey, you know what, we've got it worked out, you guys need to figure it out. We're all trying to figure it out. We are, every country sort of follows its own path, and I think, obviously the United States is a leader here, but we all need to redouble our efforts, and I think countries are understanding that they will never really move up if they don't do it.
Okay, Kathleen, what can be done to get more women on boards? I know probably lots of women are on nonprofit boards where you give them money.
Raise your hand if you're
about corporations, right?
Yeah, raise your hand if you're on a nonprofit board in the room. Yeah, pretty good smattering. Okay, now raise your hand if you're on a corporate board of any kind.
Wow.
See, look at that. It is a real issue. So at Marriott, one of the things that I did was every time we were anticipating a retirement or something, I just did research and started pushing resumes up to the CEO and the chairman of the board. So consideration is one issue. And how do you get considered? Well, there are groups that are big advocates for this. Catalyst is an organization that for decades has been advocating to get more women on corporate boards and does a lot of the research that you've been talking about that actually shows that higher performing companies actually have more women on their boards. Now the question is, are they higher performing because they're enlightened companies and that's why they put more women on the boards, or do those women's voices help make them more high performing? We don't really know the chicken or the egg, but why not go with it, right? So the other group that I brought into Marriott was called Women Corporate Directors. Women Corporate Directors essentially does boot camps to try to train women. What are the things that boards are looking for? How do you network to get your name out there? and essentially also works with companies like ours to put forth women's names. And so we brought in, we've been hosting these boot camps all over the world at our hotels because we're good at hosting events. We've also been putting our own women who are in those SVP, senior vice president roles through the boot camp, because a lot of them expressed interest to me saying, I see my counterparts who are men and they're joining these corporate boards, which is a great retirement option if you're a woman in a corporation, because you earn those salaries, but you also take all your experience and you translate it to other companies. So that's another really good organization that I would encourage you to look up. It's all about networking, and so essentially the proliferation of men on corporate boards has been, when there's an opening, people say, well, who do you know, who'd be good, and they go to the usual suspects. So what we have to do is make women the usual suspects who are recommending each other or who are finding pathways to put their names forth.
Okay, I think we're nearing the end of our time. I want to close with a kind of a contemporary issue, if you will, and that's social media, which was not around 20 years ago, is very much present in our lives today. And I think there's both a negative side to that and a positive side. So I want to ask Ambassador Russell to speak to how social media plays into the abuse and targeting of women in the conflict areas of the Middle East, Iraq, Syria, etc. And then if Jamira could talk about the website where she has founded, which is a positive use of social media first.
Well, social media is a little bit of a, as you said, a little bit of a mixed bag. And I think one of the things, we're looking at how to use social media to support women, to help women, and we are definitely seeing some evidence of that. We're also seeing, at least in some of these conflicts, that the abuse of women is used as, can be used as a recruiting tool. And so we obviously are very concerned about that and working to think better about how to address it. I think, the interesting thing about the State Department is it's a very, for those of you who have not worked there, it's a very, I guess the best word to say is bureaucratic. That's a compliment. And
right.
Anything that you do requires 8,000 clearances. And so for us to adjust to this notion of doing things really quickly on social media and without, to do a tweet without 50 people clearing off on it. That's not really the way we work at the State Department, but we're moving that way. We're adjusting to the world, and I think it's going well. But it's definitely a challenge. But I think, from my perspective, social media is it's a tool like anything else, and there are bad forces that will use it, and then there are positive forces that will use it, and we have to think about how to use it better ourselves.
How to reach all of those women who are being found in other
ways.
ways.
And reach them and explain that, you may think that you're going to go and be part of some great mission and jihad, and that you're going to, be this wonderful bride, but really you're, entering into a life of slavery where you will be, abused. And so it's really a question of, competing efforts to get the message out.
Right. Jamira, talk about Jen, why not?
So one, I would say that ironically enough, I think social media is one of probably the most impactful tools that we have out today, and it's free. Unless you're doing like ads or anything, but for the most part, it's free. And the cool thing about it is that I think it allows people opportunities to get information that they 10 years ago, 5 years ago, they wouldn't have had access to unless they bought a subscription to a newspaper or looked on the website. So I think it's really important to think about how do we use it to better inform people. And women are actually one of the biggest users of social media, and they drive a lot of the messaging, specifically on sources like Twitter and Facebook. And so through Jim Why Not, I created Jim Why Not with 3 of my friends who live in 3 different parts of the country. And the goal was really, how do we allow young people to be the experts of their own experience? How do we create spaces and places where they could share their experience in a way that can drive that can create solution-driven dialogue between elders, or our more seasoned folks, and young people. And it's creating a space where everyone is the expert and they can provide something to the issue. And so we created Jim Why Not, where we have bloggers all over the world who share stories, current events, personal anecdotes as well as we host a monthly show that allows young people to really think about the issues in their own context of either their own city and or country, and think about ways for cross collaboration either within country or across borders. And I think it's really thinking about how do you allow young people to not only use this tool, but use it for good in a way that can help to not only inform young people, but also activate them in their communities to create change.
Okay. All right. Well, if anyone has a final point they want to make, otherwise, I want to say thank you for sharing your stories, and it was quite fascinating. I always like it when I learn something. Okay.
Pleasure. Yes, you're welcome.